Lakota chief guarded a burial ridge no white would honor. A widow honored it and was wed. The deed was wrong, and I knew it before I unfolded it. It was paper, government paper, the kind that smells like old flour paste and has the Blue Eagle stamp in the corner. My nephew Red Crane brought it out from the agency in February of 1887, his horse blowing steam in the cold, and he handed it to me without saying anything because there was nothing to say. I didn't need to read the whole of it. I could see the line that mattered, a surveyor's boundary drawn 60 yards west of where it had always been drawn. 60 yards. That was enough to put Crowback Ridge on the outside of our land, on the territory side, which meant it belonged to no one, or to whoever filed next. I held the paper for a while, standing in the doorway of my lodge, and I looked up at the ridge. It was maybe a mile off, running north to south like the backbone of a buried thing. You couldn't see the markers from here. Couldn't see the poles or the prayer bundles or the old stone circle at the south end where we had laid my father and his father and his father's father going back to, when this country was nothing but grass, and the people who had always known how to live in it. My name is Thashunk Thanka, but white men had been calling me Bernard since I was 8 years old, and they took me to the school in Carlisle, and after 30 years I don't correct them anymore. I gave up that particular fight. What I didn't give up was the ridge. I went to the agency. Took me 2 days on horseback, the kind of February where the cold has a physical weight to it, and your horse leans into the wind with her ears flat. The agent's name was Fellows. He was a decent enough man as agents went, which isn't saying much, but he wasn't cruel in the way some of them were. He had a mustache that he touched when he was uncomfortable, and he touched it a great deal when I put the paper on his desk. He said the survey had been done 4 years ago and the line was settled. He said he was sorry. He touched his mustache twice. I said that ridge holds our dead going back 7 generations. I said the land is not yours to move a line across. He said he understood, he did, but it was federal land now, and there was a filing, and the filing was legal. I said, who filed? He looked at the paper and said the name, Harmon Gilchrist. Ran cattle up near the Platte. I'd never met him. Fellows said the filing had been made 6 months ago and was registered in Cheyenne, and there was nothing he could do. I rode home. I want to be honest about what those weeks were. I am 61 years old telling you this, and I have had time to see it plain. I was not a man who showed what he felt very easily. My first wife, Singing Grass, she used to say I was built like a winter hill. Everything on the surface looked bare and unmoved, but something warmer kept on living underneath. She died of the fever in '81, and I had not warmed anyone since. I had 3 grown sons and 2 daughters and 12 grandchildren, and a lodge that was never quiet but was always somehow empty. And I had this ridge, and this ridge I kept. I went up every week whether the weather allowed it or not. I walked the whole length of it, checked the markers, retied the bundles where the wind had worked them loose, cleared brush away from the stone circle in the south. It took most of a morning. I did not have words for why I needed to do it exactly. It was just that somebody had to, and I was who was left. After I got back from the agency, I went up there and I sat at the south circle for a long time, my back against the biggest stone. It was my father's stone, not his grave marker, just the stone he'd sat against when he came up here. The wind was moving things. I could hear the bundles knocking softly. I said something to him in the old language. I don't know if he heard. I said, I don't know what I'm going to do. Then April came, and a woman moved into the Hargreaves place. The Hargreaves place was 3 miles south of my land, down in the flat where the Niobrara turned. It had been empty since old Tom Hargreaves went back east to die with his sister, which was 2 winters past. A small house, sound enough, with a good well and a kitchen garden that had gone to weeds. I knew someone had bought it because I'd seen smoke from the chimney in March, and I'd heard from Jimmy Two Fingers, who knew everything that happened in the valley, that it was a woman from Missouri, a widow. Her husband had died of something in the lungs. She had a daughter, maybe 12. She had come west for reasons nobody was entirely clear on, land, maybe, or distance, or just because Missouri had become unbearable. I did not think much about her. I had my own difficulties. What happened was the cattle. In the first week of May, Gilchrist's men drove a small herd up onto the east slope of Crowback Ridge. Not all the way to the top. They probably didn't know what was at the top, but far enough that the cattle were grazing within sight of the north marker. I found out because my grandson, who was 15 and sharper than he needed to be, came riding hard to the lodge at noon and told me. I went up, 2 cowboys, young men, one of them barely old enough to shave. They were not bad young men. They were doing a job. I rode up to the nearest one and I told him who I was and I told him what was on this ridge and I told him to move the cattle down. He said he would have to ask Mr. Gilchrist, said this was filed federal land. I said I know what the paper says. I'm telling you what the ground says. Move the cattle. He said he'd ask. They moved the cattle down that day, but I knew that was only the beginning of the conversation. Men like Gilchrist didn't lose arguments by having polite young cowboys move their cattle. They lost them in court, or they didn't lose them at all. I spent 3 evenings that week writing letters. To a lawyer in Cheyenne who had helped with land questions before. To the agent fellows again. To a congressman in Washington whose name I'd seen in the papers on an Indian affairs matter. I wrote in English because that was the language the letters had to be in, and I wrote carefully and plainly and I did not beg. That was the thing I was most careful about. I was not begging. I was stating a fact, which was that my family had been burying their dead on that ridge for 200 years, and a survey line did not unmake that fact. A survey line was a piece of paper. The dead were still there. The letters got answers over the following weeks. The lawyer wrote back with some sympathy and a great deal of language about precedent and adverse possession, and he offered to review the matter for $40, which I didn't have. Fellows wrote back to say the matter was out of his hands. The congressman did not write back. The second week of May was when I first actually saw the widow. I was coming back down from the ridge late in the morning, and I took the south trail, which wound down through a stand of cottonwood that grew thick along a dry creek bed. I came around the last bend in the trees, and she was standing in the creek bed 20 feet in front of my horse, which startled both of us. My horse shied and I steadied her, and the woman did not run, which I noticed. She had a basket over one arm and her dress was muddy at the hem, and she was looking up at me with an expression that was, I would say, startled but not afraid. There's a difference. Some people, when they see me on a horse, there's fear right away. She didn't have that. She had something more like the way you look at a stranger, who's just appeared around a corner, and you're both figuring out what comes next. She said good morning. Her voice was plain, not high. She said she was looking for watercress had I seen any. I said this creek was dry most of the year. She'd find watercress down at the Niobrara if she went south about a mile. She said thank you, looked at my horse for a moment, then looked back at me and said, "You live up on that land?" I said yes. She said, "I saw you up on the ridge last week." She said it matter-of-factly, no apology in it. Said she hadn't meant to intrude, she'd been learning the geography of the valley. I said it was all right. There was a pause, and she said her name was Claire Mattingly, and she had moved into the Hargreaves place. Said it like she was giving me information I might need. I told her my name, and she didn't flinch at the Lakota of it or make a face or ask me to repeat it. Just said it back to herself quietly like she was learning a thing. She said, "Was that your family buried up there, on the ridge?" I said yes. She said I'm sorry about the cattle. Said she'd seen them, and she'd seen me send them down, and she imagined there was trouble coming from that direction. I did not know what to say to that. It was not what I expected. I said I was managing it. She said if there was anything she could do, then stopped herself, like she realized she didn't know what she had to offer. She gave a small, rueful look and said, "I suppose I don't know what that would be, but the offer stands." I said I appreciated it, rode on. I thought about that exchange more than made sense, more than once, over the following days. June came, and with it, a letter from the lawyer saying he had looked at the filing, and the filing was airtight, and my best course of action was to negotiate with Gilchrist for a covenant, which meant essentially asking the man to agree not to disturb the ridge in writing, in exchange for which Gilchrist could do whatever he liked on the rest of the land. The lawyer said this was the best outcome I was likely to get. He said this without any particular sorrow. I sat with that letter for 2 days, a covenant. Gilchrist's signature standing between my dead and the cattle, a white man's goodwill as the only thing between my father's bones and a grazing herd. I burned the letter. The morning after I burned it, Claire Mattingly showed up at my lodge. She came on foot, which meant she had walked 3 miles down the valley and then 3 miles back up it, which was 6 miles before noon. She had the same plain, practical way about her that she'd had in the creek bed. She said she'd heard there was a meeting being called by Gilchrist at the settlement house in Grayling, a kind of town meeting about the ridgeland, and she thought I should know. She said Jimmy Two Fingers had told her. I said I knew about it. She said she was going. I said I had not been invited. She said she knew. She said she was going anyway, and she would tell you what was said. I looked at her standing there in my yard in the morning light, and I tried to figure out what she wanted. People who offered things usually wanted something. She had a straight back and work-roughened hands, and she looked like a woman who said what she meant and didn't have much patience for the alternative. I said, "You don't know me." She said, "No, but I've been walking this valley 2 months and you're the only person in it who's treating something with any kind of respect." She said it quietly, not like a compliment, more like an observation. Then she said, "My husband is buried in Missouri and I think about it every day whether somebody is tending the place." She stopped, said, "Anyway, I'm going to the meeting." She went. She came back the next afternoon and sat in my yard on the bench by the door and told me everything. Gilchrist was not at the meeting. He'd sent his foreman, a man named Cal Stroud. Stroud had been genial and dismissive, the worst combination. Had talked about the ridge like it was a grazing problem to be managed, had said the family of Bernard. And here she stopped and pronounced my Lakota name instead of Bernard, which was not what I expected, had historical use of the ridge, but that historical use was not ownership. He said the tribe was welcome to petition for a restricted covenant through the agency, which was exactly what the lawyer had said. She said about 15 people were at the meeting. She said maybe a quarter of them seemed bothered by the whole thing. The rest either didn't care or were doing business with Gilchrist. She said an older man named Gunderson had spoken up, said it didn't sit right to run cattle across burial ground, and had been more or less talked over. I said thank you. She said I told Stroud you'd been going up to that ridge every week for as long as anyone in the valley could remember, that you maintained it and kept it. Stroud said that was admirable. The way she said the word admirable told me exactly what Stroud's face had looked like when he said it. She said I also said that if Gilchrist drove cattle onto that ridge, the whole northern half of the valley was going to know about it, and there would be people who didn't want to do business with a man who let his cattle walk over someone's grandfather's grave. She said Stroud had not liked that. She said Stroud had said she was a newcomer and maybe didn't understand how things worked in this part of the territory. I asked her what she said to that. She said she told him she understood fine. She'd grown up in a river town in Missouri where powerful men ran things their way and called it the natural order. And she'd found that usually the natural order was mostly convenient for the men who'd set it up. That was when I laughed. I don't laugh easily or often, and I was surprised by it, and she looked a little surprised too, and then she smiled, which changed her whole face. She had been serious and matter-of-fact the whole time, and the smile was different, warmer, like something she kept for private moments. She said she didn't know if any of it would help. I said it was something. It was more than anything the lawyer had managed. She said she'd thought about what she could offer, and this was it. She could talk to people, white people, in ways they'd listen, and say the same things I'd been saying. I said, "You don't have to do that." She said, "I know I don't have to." She stayed another hour and we talked, which I did not plan on. She was curious without being intrusive, which is a balance most people can't manage. She asked about the ridge, not about the legal problem but about the place itself, what it looked like, why that particular hill. I found myself describing it. The way the stones on the south slope were almost orange in the evening light. The way my father had told him that his father had told him that the ridge caught the wind from 4 directions at once in a way that no other hill in the valley did. And so, the spirits of the dead had an easy passage no matter which way they were going. She listened like it was worth listening to. She left and I sat there in the yard a long time after. What I am trying to describe, and doing poorly, is something that doesn't have a clean name. It was not that I suddenly saw her as a woman and thought about the future. It was more that something eased, somewhere in me that had been held tight for a long time. Like a rope you've been pulling against for so many years you forget there's anything but the pulling, and then someone takes some of the weight, not all of it, just some, and you feel the difference. I didn't let myself think about it too much. I was 60 years old and had been alone for 6 years, and I had more urgent things. July was when Gilchrist came himself. He rode up to my lodge on a Tuesday morning with Stroud and 2 other men, which told me he had thought about whether to come alone and decided not to. He was maybe 55, heavy through the middle, with an expensive hat and the kind of sunburn that comes from a lot of years outdoors. He dismounted and came to the yard in the way men who own things move, like the ground expects them. He said he wanted to talk straight. I said all right. He said he'd looked at the ridge himself, ridden its length, said he could see it was a meaningful place, said he respected the fact of it. Then he said what all that respectful preamble was in service of. He said the land was filed and settled, and he needed to be able to use the northern range, and he was willing to leave the top of the ridge alone, the stone circle and the markers, but he needed the east and west slopes for grazing. I said the east slope is where we laid the younger dead. I said there's no part of that ridge that is just grass to me. He said he understood that, but he had an obligation to his cattle operation and a legal right to the land, and he was trying to find a middle way. I said the middle way is that you don't run cattle on ground where my family is buried. He said he'd been hoping we could be reasonable. I said I am being entirely reasonable. That was where it ended. He left, and Stroud looked back at me from his horse with an expression that said this was not finished, which I already knew. I went up to the ridge that afternoon. I was not angry, which surprised me. I had been angry for months. A long, low, constant anger like a fire that's burning in the wall of a building and you can't see it but you can feel the heat. That afternoon I just felt tired. I sat at my father's stone and I was tired in the way that goes all the way through you. Claire Mattingly was at the north end of the ridge when I came down. I don't know how long she'd been there. She was standing at the first marker, not touching it, just looking at it. She heard my horse and turned, and she didn't say anything apologetic or explanatory, just said, "Is it all right that I'm here?" I said yes. She said she'd seen Gilchrist and his men ride out from my place, and she'd guessed what it was. She said she was sorry. I said what she'd done at the meeting, what she'd said to Stroud. It had been more than most people would do. She said it wasn't enough. I said no. We stood there a minute, both of us looking north, the valley spread out below us in the afternoon light. It was the kind of day that makes you understand why people settled here, if you can manage to look at it without thinking about everything that looking at it correctly. She said, "I have a little money." Not much. She said her husband had left her the land in Missouri and she'd sold it. She said she didn't know if a lawyer would take a case for burial rights, if that was even a thing you could bring, but she'd pay the $40. I turned and looked at her. She was watching the valley. Her jaw was set in a particular way that I recognized, the way a person looks when they've decided something and aren't going to unsay it. I said, "That's your money, your start out here." She said, "I know what it is." I said, "You barely know me." She said she'd been thinking about that. She looked at me then, steady, not away. She said, "I know you well enough to know what you're doing up here and why." She said, "That's more than I know about most people I've known for years." I didn't answer right away. The wind was moving the prayer bundles, and the cottonwoods were turning silver in it. I said, "I can't take your money." She said she wasn't giving it to me. She was hiring the lawyer. We looked at each other. She had these gray eyes that were very direct, not unkind, just direct, the kind that have seen some difficulty and didn't flinch from it. I thought again about Singing Grass, about what she'd said, that I was like a winter hill. Singing Grass had known how to find the warmth underneath. And here was this woman from Missouri, standing on my family's burial ridge in the wind, saying she'd already decided. I said she should come down and have some coffee before she walked back. She did. That was July. The lawyer, his name was McKendrick, Atticus McKendrick, practiced in Cheyenne and had once argued a land case before the territorial court. He was a thin man with reading glasses he kept losing and finding in his own pockets. Claire sent him $40 and a letter laying out the situation, and 3 weeks later he wrote back saying the case was complicated but not hopeless. There was some precedent, he thought, in recent Bureau of Indian Affairs language about ancestral use rights, and he wanted to file an injunction against development of the ridge pending a hearing. It would take time. It would not be certain. But it was something. McKendrick came out in August to see the ridge himself. I walked the whole length of it with him, showed him every marker, explained every section, told him the names of those buried and what I knew of their stories going back as far as the stories went. He took notes. He was respectful in the way of a man who is approaching something he doesn't fully understand but has enough sense to know it. He asked Claire questions, too, about the meeting in Grayling and what Stroud had said, and she answered precisely, with the kind of memory for detail and phrasing that made me think she must have sat with it afterward and written it down. Riding down from the ridge at the end of that long day, I was behind McKendrick and Claire rode beside me, and the evening was coming in orange and slow over the western plains, and she said quietly, "He's going to do a good job." I said, "I think so." She said, "You've been doing this alone a long time." I said, "Yes." She said, "I don't mean just the ridge." I looked at her. She was looking straight ahead at the trail, that set jaw again, like she'd said a thing she'd thought about and was going to stand behind it. I didn't answer, but I thought about it all the way home and into the night. The injunction was filed in September. Gilchrist got word of it, and there was a week where I wasn't sure what he was going to do, whether he'd get angry enough to push forward and test us before the hearing, put the cattle on the ridge out of pure stubbornness. Stroud came by once, and I was at the lodge, and we talked in the yard, carefully, both of us knowing there was a line we were standing on either side of. He said Gilchrist was a fair man when people dealt with him fairly. I said I had dealt with no one but fairly. He looked at me a long time. He wasn't a stupid man, Stroud. He knew the cattle belonged somewhere else. I think he even knew what the ridge was, what it held. He had that look men get when they understand something but don't have the authority to act on it. He put his hat back on and rode out, and that was the last I heard from him directly. The cattle stayed off the ridge. I went up every week. The bundles needed retying in a September wind that came in hard from the northwest, and I spent 2 hours up there working my way along the markers, my hands cold in it, the sky going that deep blue it gets in September before the cold really settles in. I found one of the stone markers at the north end had shifted. Not much, maybe 4 inches, but it was off the line my grandfather had set. I spent an hour wrestling it back into the right position with a crowbar I'd carried up for that purpose, working it by feel as much as by eye because I knew where it was supposed to be from having seen it so many times. When I got it right, I stood back and looked at it, and there was a satisfaction in that, the small kind, the kind that comes from a job that needed doing now done. Not a feeling I could explain to anyone who hadn't spent years on that ridge. Just right. It was right again. My son Chante Hawthorne, the oldest, came up with me the first week of October. He was 38 and lived 3 miles east with his wife and children, and came to my lodge most Sundays. He had heard about the injunction and about McKendrick and about the $40, and he asked me directly on the ride-up who had put in that money. I said Claire Mattingly. He said the widow at the Hargreaves place. I said yes. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, why? I said I think because she's a decent woman who thought it was right. He was quiet again. He's like me, he processes things sideways, not straight on. We walked the length of the ridge together and I showed him the reset marker, and he nodded at it and ran his hand along the top of the stone. He knows that ridge almost as well as I do. I started bringing him up when he was 4 or 5, setting him down in the South Circle and telling him the names, the same way my father had set me down and told me. At the south end, he said, she came up here. I said once, to the north marker. He said, and you didn't mind. I said no. He looked at the valley a long time, then he said all right, okay, which was all he said, but I understood it. The other 2 sons came around in their own time and their own ways. My youngest, Chante Chiniela, who was 26 and had his mother's directness, asked me flat out in November whether I was considering the widow seriously. I said I was. He thought about it with his arms crossed and then said, she seems like she knows what she's choosing. That was all. I took it as approval, which I think was what it was. Claire brought food to my lodge twice that fall. The second time she stayed for supper and met my daughter Wachiniela, who was 32, and who looked at her with an expression I couldn't read, assessing, not hostile. They talked while I was doing something with the horses and I could hear them through the window. Claire asked about the Lakota name, and Wachiniela told her what it meant in English. Something along the lines of she who dances in the spirit of a small bird, but that doesn't carry the same weight. When I came back and Claire asked me how to say it correctly and practiced it until she had it close enough that Wachiniela said, not bad, with a ghost of approval. After supper, my daughter went to her own lodge and Claire helped wash up, which I told her she didn't have to do, and she did it anyway. We sat with coffee after and the fire was low and the wind was outside doing something. She said she'd written to her daughter, who was living with Claire's sister in Kansas City, while Claire got the place set up. She said she hoped to bring the girl out in the spring. I said, what's her name? She said Alina, but she goes by Nell. I said, how old? She said 13 now. There was a comfortable silence, and the fire shifted. I said, I've been thinking about what you said in August, about not doing this alone. She waited. I said, I want to be plain with you about what my life is. I said it's this valley and this ridge and those people up there, and then whatever years I have left, and then I'll be up there too. I said I am not a young man, and I am not an easy one. My first wife was better than I deserved, and she would tell you herself that I was not easy. Claire said I'm not easy either. She said I'm stubborn, and I have my own opinions about things, and they don't usually change just because someone would like them to. I said I've noticed. She said I have a daughter who is going to need things. School, a home, someone to show her how to be in the world. I said I know. She said I'm not asking you for promises. She said I'm just saying I see what you are. She looked at me straight across the table, the same gray eyes. She said you are the most decent man I've met in a long time, and you're keeping faith with something most people would have given up on. She said I think that matters. I held that for a moment, the fire. I said there will be people in this valley who don't like it. She said there are people in every valley who don't like things. She said she'd grown up understanding that, and had stopped letting it organize her choices sometime in her mid-30s. I said, "All right." She said, "All right what?" I said, "All right, I'd like you to stay, if that's what you're considering." She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "Yes, that's what I'm considering." I reached across the table and put my hand on hers. She turned it over and held on, and I felt the calluses on her palm from months of work, and hers were not so different from mine. We didn't say anything else about it that night. She walked home in the dark with a lantern, and I watched the light move down the south trail until the trees took it. The hearing was in November. McKendrick argued it in Cheyenne, and I was there, Claire beside me, and it took most of 2 days. The judge was a man named Harwick, who listened the way judges listen, with a face that gives away nothing. Gilchrist had a lawyer too, better dressed than McKendrick, with a stronger voice, and the legal arguments were technical in ways I couldn't always follow. What I could follow was what each side was saying underneath the arguments. Gilchrist's lawyer was saying, "The Indians' feelings about this land are feelings, and feelings don't override filed claims." McKendrick was saying, 200 years of burial and care is not a feeling, it is a use, and a use has standing. I will tell you something about those 2 days that I don't tell often. The first evening after the court recessed, I walked out into the street in Cheyenne, and it was cold, real cold, a November that meant it, and I stood there a while. Claire came out behind me and stood beside me without asking what I was doing there, and we walked without talking until we found a place to eat, a small cafe with a wood stove going hard in the corner, and we sat across from each other with coffee and soup, and neither of us spoke much. She wasn't quiet because she had nothing to say. She was quiet because she understood what the day had been and knew there was no fixing it with words. That kind of quiet takes something in a person. Most people fill the silence, she didn't. After supper she said, "McKendrick was better than them today." I said I thought so too. I didn't know if it was enough. She said it was. She said it with a certainty that wasn't false comfort, just her own assessment delivered plainly. She was usually right in her assessments. I'd noticed that about her. That night I sat in the room the hotel had given me, and I wrote out all the names I knew going back from my father. 6 generations solid. Started with my sons and went back. I don't know exactly why I did it. Some kind of steadying maybe. Something to do with my hands in a place where there was nothing else I could do. I wrote until the candle burned low, and then I folded the paper and put it in my coat pocket and kept it there for the rest of the hearing. On the second afternoon, Judge Harwick allowed me to speak. I had prepared something, but when I stood up I put the paper away. I talked about my father and his father. I talked about the stone at the south end and what it felt like to sit against it. I talked about going up every week in the winter, my hands working in the cold to keep the markers right, because someone had to, and I was who was left. I talked about being taken to Carlisle at 8 years old and coming back at 18 to a world that had changed around me and finding the ridge the same. I said the ridge had kept me as much as I had kept it. I did not ask for anything in that speech. I just said what was true. Judge Harwick looked at me for a long time after I sat down. I looked back at him. I was not going to look away from a man who was deciding what was true about my family. Then he said the court would take the matter under advisement and issue a ruling within 60 days. On the stage back north, somewhere in the dark between Cheyenne and Fort Laramie, Claire fell asleep against my shoulder. She'd been awake since before dawn both days and had been in that courtroom with me the whole time without complaint, taking notes I didn't ask her to take in a small notebook she produced from her coat. I didn't move. I sat there with the dark going by outside the window and her weight against me, and I held onto the seat strap and let her sleep. That was probably the moment, if I'm honest. Not any of the words we'd said to each other, just that. It was 61 days. We got the letter in January. The ruling restricted development and cattle use of the full ridge under a protected burial covenant. A permanent one, not the kind Gilchrist could renegotiate or override. Gilchrist kept his filed claim on the surrounding land, but the ridge was locked. McKendrick wrote that it was a notable ruling. He said he was going to write it up for a law journal. I read the letter twice. Then I went up to the ridge in the January cold, and I walked the whole length of it. The bundles were all right. The stone circle at the south end was dusted with snow, and the stones were dark against it, and the orange streaks in them had gone gray in the winter light, but they were there. I sat down at my father's stone. I said I held it. That was all, but I think he heard. Claire was at my lodge when I came down, sitting on the bench by the door with her coat pulled tight, because she had seen me go up and she'd guessed. She stood when she saw my face. I said the ruling came through. She pressed her lips together, a quick expression contained the way she contained things. Then she said, "Good." I sat down on the bench, and after a moment she sat beside me close, and she put her arm through mine in a way that was easy and natural, like it was something we'd been doing for years. The valley was very quiet. January quiet, where sound carries a long way and there isn't much of it. We were married in March, which is early enough in the spring that there was still cold in the mornings. We were married in the Lakota way, which I proposed and which she considered for a week and then agreed to. And then we were married in the courthouse in Grayling the following day, which she proposed and which I considered for about 30 seconds and agreed to. Both of these things seemed right to us. The Lakota ceremony was done by my uncle, Wombley Gleshka, who was 73 and had been doing these things for 50 years and had opinions about how they should be done. He had not entirely made up his mind about Claire, but he performed the ceremony with full seriousness, which I took as acceptance by the back door, which is how acceptance usually comes in my family. My daughter put Claire's hair up in a style that took 2 hours, and that Wachiniella was quietly proud of afterward. Claire sat through all of it without fidgeting or asking how long it would go, which impressed people without her knowing she was being observed for it. At the courthouse the next day, the justice of the peace was a man named Dillard, who had known me for years and who shook Claire's hand warmly and seemed genuinely pleased. There were a handful of people from Grayling who had heard and come to see, some out of goodwill and some out of curiosity and maybe 1 or 2 out of neither, but they were there and we were there. And Dillard said the words and Claire said yes she did, and I said yes I did, and that was a marriage in 2 kinds of law, which seemed thorough enough. My daughter Wachiniella was there for the first and said almost nothing but embraced Claire, which told me something. My sons were there too, and they were more reserved, but they came, and by the time we ate together that evening things were easier. Red Crane, my nephew, made a speech that went on longer than anyone needed it to but had good feeling in it. The months after that were the ordinary work of 2 people making one life from 2 separate ones. I don't have a lot of softness to dress that up with. It is work, that kind of making. There are habits of a long time alone that don't yield easily, and I had plenty of them. She had hers too. She was accustomed to running her own household entirely her own way, and I was accustomed to running mine entirely my own way. And the overlap of those 2 things required some time and some patience and some plain talking, of which she was more capable than me and more willing. We had conversations I would rather not have had, 2 or 3 of them, and we came out of them still married, which I take as the whole point of having them. Claire's daughter Nell arrived in April on the stage from Cheyenne, which Claire met, and I met her mother. And Nell was 13 years old with her mother's gray eyes and a quality of watchfulness that I recognized, the quality of a child who has learned to pay attention because the world does not always do what it's supposed to. She shook my hand with a firm grip and looked at me straight and said she'd heard I had horses. I said I had several. She said could she see them? I said absolutely. She walked beside me to the corral in the way of a person who is making assessments while appearing not to, and I let her look her fill, and I told her about each horse without being asked, and she listened with her hands on the top rail. After a while she said which one was mine to learn on. I pointed to a bay mare named Cedar, steady and patient and smart enough to teach. Nell nodded like that was the right answer. I don't say this to put a bow on anything. A 14-year-old girl deciding to trust a Lakota man she just met is not a small thing, and it did not resolve in a single afternoon at a corral. There were months of it, careful months, and there were days when she was somewhere else in herself and didn't want to be reached. And I know what that feels like from the inside, so I left her alone in it, and eventually she usually came around. That's the honest account. What I can say is that by that first fall, she was riding Cedar down into the valley with a confidence that made her mother watch from the porch with a look I recognized. A particular kind of satisfaction that has some ache in it, the way it does when someone you love is becoming who they're going to be. I went up to the ridge every week. I still do. Claire has been up with me a dozen times by now. The first time, the full walk, she was quiet most of the way, and at the south circle she looked at the stones for a while and she reached out and touched the top of my father's stone lightly, once, with the flat of her hand. She didn't say anything. There was nothing that needed saying. Nell came up once, in October of her first year, and she walked the length with me without asking to hurry, and without asking a lot of questions, just moving beside me in that watchful, quiet way she has. And when we got to the south circle she asked how far back they went, and I told her what I knew, which goes back 7 generations solidly and probably further, but without names I can give. She said 7 generations out loud to herself like she was doing the arithmetic. Then she said that's a long time to keep something. I said it's the job. She thought about that, then she said, well, you're doing it. And I was. I am. I have Claire's arm in mine on the cold mornings when she walks up with me, and the valley below is the same valley it has always been, and the bundles catch the wind from all 4 directions, and my father is in the south circle under an inch of new snow, and whatever years I have left I will go up there and keep it, and after that someone else will, because that's how these things have to work if they're going to work at all. But right now it's the job and I'm the one here, and I'm not alone in it. And I haven't been since that woman from Missouri showed up in a dry creek bed asking about watercress, and decided that what she saw on a ridge in the valley was worth honoring. That's the whole of it. That's the whole story.